They were born into royalty, cradled in silk, surrounded by gold, destined, perhaps, for thrones. But you won't find their names in the history books. No portraits, no graves, no legacy. Royal children who were different, hidden from sight, whisked away in silence, erased from memory as if they had never lived at all. Not because they were dangerous, not because they committed treason, but because they were born with Down syndrome. In the shadows of the world's most powerful dynasties lies a chilling truth history tried to bury. This is the dark fate of royal children born with Down syndrome, a story of silence, exile, and a world that refused to see them. Royalty has always been a performance. Every gesture, every word, every air carefully choreographed to project power, beauty, and divine order. From the outside, monarchies looked eternal, immaculate, untouchable. But behind those towering walls of marble and stone, truth was far more fragile in the eyes of the court. The birth of a royal child was not just a private joy, it was a matter of state, a symbol of continuity, a tool of diplomacy, a future ruler sculpted to embody perfection. So when a child entered the world bearing traits that deviated from that ideal, a silent panic took hold. They would never say the word aloud. Not in public, not even in private sometimes. But those who served the crown recognized the signs: a flatter face, almond-shaped eyes, a gentleness in movement, a delay in speech, a child with Down syndrome. To the royal image makers, such a child posed an unspeakable dilemma. If acknowledged, the child could be mocked by foreign courts, questioned by the clergy, and feared by nobles. If kept, the dynasty's myth of purity cracked. But to discard them entirely, that required a colder resolve and centuries of silence. There are records, faint, broken, sometimes coded, of such children, a fleeting mention in a midwife's letter. A royal birth announced, then quickly forgotten. A baby who fell ill and passed quietly, though no grave is ever found. In some cases, the child was sent away to a remote estate. In others, to a monastery or convent under another name. And in the most haunting accounts, the child simply vanished from the archives. Not murdered, necessarily, but erased, because for the royal family, imperfection was not merely inconvenient, it was a threat. This is where the real tragedy begins. Not in the diagnosis, but in the denial of love, of visibility, of humanity. These children were born into the highest ranks of society, and yet they were treated as if they were less than anyone else. Their crime, existing outside the myth. No matter how grand the palace, there were always rooms that no one spoke of. Rooms where curtains stayed drawn, where footsteps were muffled, and where time itself seemed to stand still. Behind these doors, away from the feasts and ceremonies, the forgotten ones lived out their quiet days. They were royal by blood, but strangers to the world beyond those walls. Silence was the first rule. Servants were forbidden to speak of them. Doctors and wet nurses sworn to secrecy. Even among family members, their existence was reduced to vague euphemisms. The delicate one, the little soul who could not bear the weight of court life, the child better kept away from the eyes of the people. But the silence did more than hide a person. It stripped them of their identity. These children, born with Down syndrome, were rarely given full titles. Some were not baptized publicly. Their names were whispered or never spoken at all. In royal genealogies, they were omitted, not deceased, not disowned, simply unwritten. And yet, they lived. They breathed, they smiled, they clung to the few hands that held them without fear. Sometimes it was a maid, a governess, a distant cousin kept out of succession. People who saw them not as a scandal, but as a child, vulnerable, human, worthy of affection. And in those small acts of kindness, a kind of defiance bloomed against the cruelty of the system. But compassion, in this world, was fragile. The moment politics shifted, or rumors spread, even that limited mercy could vanish. The child might be moved again, farther away. Or worse, their story could be buried so deeply that future generations would not even know they ever existed. And so, in a palace overflowing with riches and lineage, a child with Down syndrome could live in isolation more complete than any. Prison, not because of who they were, but because of who the world refused to let them be. When the palace could no longer contain them, they were sent away. Not to homes, not to hospitals, but to places deliberately chosen for their silence. Remote monasteries, isolated convents, rural estates buried in snow and time. These were not places of healing. They were places of disappearance. The official narrative often said they were too delicate for court life, or that they had retired to a peaceful setting for their well-being. But in truth, these transfers were acts of erasure. The farther from the throne, the less their existence threatened the myth. Within these cloisters, life was slow, regimented, and cold. Emotionally and physically, the air of ritual hung over everything. Bells marked the hours, chores filled the days, and though a child with Down syndrome might receive basic care, warmth and affection were never guaranteed. There were no royal tutors, no games, no birthdays, just stone walls, long corridors, and the distant echo of a world that had refused to see them. Some religious orders treated these children with compassion. Others, sadly, did not. In the worst cases, they were seen not as innocent souls, but as burdens. Symbols of sin, impurity, or divine punishment. Whispers of exorcism, isolation cells, and harsh penance appear in a few surviving accounts. But most of the records are gone. Monastic archives from those centuries are either sealed, destroyed, or simply blank where the names should have been, as if history itself conspired to forget them. Yet here and there, a trace remains. An entry in an abbess's journal describing a young noble child who speaks little but smiles often. A faded fresco where one figure's face was scrubbed out. A burial marked only with a single word, unknown. These fragments do not tell us everything, but they tell us enough. Enough to know that these children lived, that they felt, that they were cast aside, not by fate, but by choice, and that the cost of royal perfection was paid, in part, by their silence. For monarchies, legacy is everything. Bloodlines are traced with obsessive precision. Family trees adorn the walls of castles. Every child born to a royal house is, in theory, a link in an unbroken chain, one that stretches back through centuries, of divine right and conquest. But not every link is recorded, and not every name is written in ink. Behind closed doors, royal archivists were instructed to edit. Midwives were paid to remain silent. Chroniclers simply skipped over certain births, or referred to them with vague, coded language, a stillborn soul, a child not fit for courtly life, taken by the angels before the christening. But the child had lived, for months, sometimes years. They had walked, babbled, laughed. Yet, when the royal lineage was etched into marble, their names were not among the others. It was not death that erased them, it was choice. Because, in the eyes of the ruling class, a child with Down syndrome represented a contradiction, noble by blood, yet incapable in their view of leadership, marriage, or alliance. A political liability, a symbolic flaw. To acknowledge them was to expose the fragility of the dynasty's claim to perfection. And so, families rewrote their own histories. In some cases, siblings were told nothing. Future kings and queens grew up believing they were only children, never knowing that a brother or sister had once been held in their mother's arms. Letters were destroyed, portraits unfinished. Even servants who remembered them were dismissed or silenced. But secrets rot slowly. Centuries later, researchers uncovered faint clues, birth records that didn't match death certificates, portraits where a child was painted over, gravestones moved or deliberately misnamed. Genetic testing of royal remains has even raised quiet questions historians are still afraid to answer. These revelations are not just scandals. They are wounds. Wounds that speak to how deeply monarchy once feared imperfection, because in the quest for control over blood, image, and narrative, even the most innocent were not spared. Silence always has a cost. For the children, it meant a life unlit. Not just in the literal sense, though many died young, but in the erasure of their place in the world. They were denied identity, affection, and even the dignity of being. Remembered, their entire existence was treated as a blemish to be scrubbed away, rather than a life to be understood. But the price was not only paid by them, royal families, in sealing away their most vulnerable members, also sealed away their own humanity. Generation after generation, monarchies taught themselves to fear difference, to treat deviation from the norm as a threat, rather than a reflection of life's true complexity. This fear poisoned more than just bloodlines. It infected the culture. Around them, what the royals hid, the public learned to despise. If kings and queens were ashamed of these children, then what chance did commoners have to accept their own? The message echoed outward. To be born different was to be born unworthy, and so stigma took root, not just in palaces, but in villages, cities, and churches. Children with disabilities were cast aside, institutionalized, or shamed into invisibility, not always because of malice, but because a system built on perfection demanded nothing less. That legacy lingers, even today, in parts of the world. Children with Down syndrome are still hidden, aborted, or discarded, victims of the same mindset that once ruled from gilded thrones. The tools have changed, the faces have changed, but the fear of imperfection remains stubbornly familiar, and the worst part, most people have no idea where it began. The roots lie buried deep beneath centuries of royal silence, behind castle walls, beneath altered records and missing names. It started not with hatred, but with shame, with the refusal to acknowledge that even kings and queens could give birth to someone who didn't fit the mold, and in doing so, they taught the world to forget those who never had a voice to begin with. History cannot hide everything. No matter how carefully the records were scrubbed, how many names omitted or portraits painted over, traces remain, faint, fragmented, buried under centuries of dust. But they are there. A scribbled note in the margin of a midwife's journal, long dismissed as a curiosity. A family tree in a forgotten cathedral, where an unnamed branch was mysteriously cut short. An inventory of clothing for a child who, officially, had never existed. A single pair of shoes, preserved in a box, too small to have belonged to any. Known heir. To most, these scraps would mean nothing, but to those who looked closely, Historians, archivists, descendants, they whisper a different story. A story of lives once lived in silence. Of royal children born with Down syndrome, remembered not in glory, but in glimpses. Sometimes it is a painting dot. One in particular hangs in a private gallery in Europe. It depicts a child in royal dress, but with subtle features, rounded eyes, a soft smile, a gaze that lingers somewhere beyond the canvas. There is no name attached, no date, just a title, the quiet one. In other cases, the memory survives in oral tradition. Elderly caretakers recalling, in hushed tones, the special child who lived on the third floor, who never spoke but loved music. A song once sung only in the servant quarters, about a prince who watched the stars every night but was never allowed to speak to them. These fragments, scattered across time and geography, tell us more than we expect. Not just that these children existed, but that someone remembered, that someone cared, that someone, somewhere, chose not to forget. And in that remembering, a kind of justice begins to stir. Fragile, yes, but powerful, because the first step in breaking silence is simply to say the words. They were here, they were royal, they were human, and they mattered. For centuries, no one asked questions. The archives remained sealed. The family trees stayed immaculate. The portraits hung in perfect rows, untouched, unquestioned. But silence cannot last forever, and history, once disturbed, begins to tremble. In recent decades, a quiet reckoning has begun. Advances in genetic research, forensic science, and digital archives have allowed scholars to peer deeper than ever into royal histories. What they found is not conclusive, but it is troubling. Birth records that don't match death dates. Travel logs with unnamed companions. Private letters referring to the child we don't speak of. Medical descriptions eerily aligned with what we now recognize as Down syndrome. Even more unsettling are the confessions, in interviews given late in life. Former palace staff, freed from oaths of silence and fear of reprisal, have spoken, in vague but heartbreaking terms, of children with gentle hearts and curious eyes, who were kept upstairs or sent away in the night. Of royal mothers who wept behind locked doors, and fathers who ordered the name never be written. And now as these accounts accumulate, the public begins to ask, what else have we been taught not to see? Museums have quietly altered labels. Royal biographies are being revised, and in some cases, descendants have begun to acknowledge, carefully, cautiously, that someone is missing. Not as a scandal, not as shame, but as truth. This reckoning is not about blame alone. It's about mourning what was lost. Not just the children themselves, but the chance to have known them, the music they might have made, the peace they could have brought, the joy that never had a chance to echo through the halls of power. And it forces a larger question. If even the most visible families in the world could hide their most vulnerable members, what does that say about the rest of us? What do we still choose not to see? Not every story ends with justice, but some stories ask only to be told. The royal children born with Down syndrome may never receive statues or state funerals. Their names, in many cases, are gone forever, buried beneath layers of denial, shame, and silence. But memory is not always written in stone. Sometimes it lives in something quieter, in the willingness to look, to listen, to say, this happened. They were born into gold, but wrapped in secrecy, given titles, but denied identity, held briefly, in royal arms, then let slip through the cracks of history. And yet, they were here. They smiled, they played, they reached for light, even in places where none was offered. To remember them is not just to look back, it is to look inward, to ask what kind of world we've inherited, and what kind we wish to pass on. A world where worth is not measured by perfection, but by presence. Where every life, no matter how different, is given space to be seen, heard, and loved. Perhaps we cannot name them, but we can break the silence they were born into. We can refuse to let history forget them again, not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because they were human, and that is enough.